Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we begin with part 1 of The Mystery of the Feathered Serpent by Manly P. Hall, an article taken from The All-Seeing Eye, Volume 5, Number 10, July 1931. The Mystery of the Feathered Serpent by Manly P. Hall. One has but to examine the surviving fragments of Nahutian mythology and history to realize that a high order of metaphysical learning existed among the original Americans. Even Roman Catholic writers admitted that magic flourished among the peoples of Mexico, and that the priests and philosophers of that nation were deeply versed in astrology and the necromantic arts. The episode of the arrest and detention of 2 Aztec sorcerers accused by the Church of attempting to weave spells against the Christian clergy is especially interesting, for even the pious fathers were forced to admit that their prisoners dissolved into empty air before their very eyes, a circumstance which was passed over very lightly. The ill-fated Montezuma was surrounded by seers and prophets who, from signs which appeared in the heavens, warned the emperor that the conquistadors with their horses and guns were not emissaries from the sun god, but plundering mortals with an eye for loot. Montezuma, being a great prince, was well learned in the lore of his people, and it was this very learning that proved his undoing. The most ancient traditions of his race, perpetuated by the wisest of each generation, declared that the history of the world was divided into 5 great epochs. These 5 vast periods were separated from each other by great cataclysms in which great portions of mankind perished. In the Codex Vaticanus it is written that in the first age water reigned supreme until at last it rose up and swallowed all creatures save 2 who escaped by means of a tree. As the form of a ship appears in this tradition, it is likely that the tree was hollowed out to form a crude boat in which the Mexican Noah and his wife rode safely over the deluge. In this first age, there were also giants and strange monsters with teeth that weighed 3 pounds each. The second age was that of wind, which by the force of its blowing finally destroyed the whole world. 1 man and 1 woman survived this destruction also by concealing themselves within a hollow stone, which was so heavy that the wind could not blow it away. During this period, great masses of humanity were changed into apes. The third age was that of fire, and was ended by a terrible outburst of flames which burned up the world. Again, Noah and his wife were saved this time by seeking refuge in subterranean caverns where the terrible heat could not reach them. The fourth age was that of present humanity, and its destruction will be brought about by sin, the sin of man. It is called in the Old Codex the Age of the Black Hair. It was in the early centuries of this age that the great race of the Toltecs, under their divine priest-king Quetzalcoatl, were destroyed by the sorcery of the Nahuas under their demon war god Tezcatlipoca. All this Montezuma knew, and from the same traditions he had also learned that a 5th age was to come, a golden age in which the gods would return, or more correctly, turn with favor to the Aztec nation through their ministering intermediary, the feathered snake. Quetzalcoatl had promised to return, leading a mighty army that should deliver Mexico from its afflictions and its bondage to gods of war and death. When the ships of Cortez anchored in the harbor at Veracruz, Montezuma immediately dispatched messengers with offerings and protestations of allegiance. These, paddling their canoes to the sides of the Spanish vessels, made known as best they could that they had come in search of the great white god of the sun. Cortez and his companions, amazed beyond words but determined to benefit by the circumstances, decided upon subterfuge. Cortez put on his most splendid garments and his most highly polished armor. He had a throne erected for himself on the deck of the ship and created as much of an atmosphere of dignity as circumstances permitted. Then, with mock solemnity, he received the ambassadors of Montezuma, conveying to them the impression that he was the great white prince of the feathered snake whom they had awaited so long. The mere coincidence that Cortez arrived at Veracruz on the very anniversary of the departure of Quetzalcoatl gave even greater credence to the Indians' belief, and the Aztec messengers fell on their knees before Cortez, and after kissing the deck of the ship and performing other rites of homage, they crowned the Spanish conqueror in a bonnet of quetzal plumes, robed him in ceremonial vestments, and honored him as the very person of the god. The ambassadors then explained that Montezuma, in all humility, besought the returned god to accept back his kingdom and bestow the gift of wisdom and peace upon his people. Montezuma was a man of considerable personal integrity, and his attitude throughout the entire period of the Spanish invasion was most commendable. He was neither a proud nor a warlike monarch, his earlier actions being marked with humility and his later ones goaded by desperation and abuse. It is said of Montezuma that when he was called to the throne, the ministers sent to find him discovered the prince sweeping out the courtyard of the temple, and that they had to take the broom from his hands to make him king. Montezuma admitted that many of the priceless treasures of his people's religion had been lost or forgotten in the numerous vicissitudes through which the nation had passed. Thereafter, he besought the returned god to restate the tenets of life and truth. The confidence which the Aztec king reposed in Cortés was utterly betrayed, and the virtuous advances which the Indian prince made were turned against him, becoming the major causes of his downfall and cruel death. The old gods of the Aztecs, however, were not totally unavenged, for when the Spaniards began the colonization of Mexico, they died by thousands, not from Aztec spears, but from plagues generated in the marshes and bogs which surrounded the great Aztec capital. Quetzalcoatl was a name to conjure with, and its power was known from the southern borders of the United States to the high peaks of the Andes. By the Quiches, he was called Gucumats, by the Mayans, Kukulkan, and by the Incas, possibly Thonapa. He was not only a hero king, but the central figure of a mystery cult, served by a hierarchy of priests who termed themselves serpents, and by virtue of their rituals of consecration, partook of the very nature of the god himself. The initiates of the Quetzalcoatl cult, as we learn from the writing of de Bourbourg, referred to themselves as the sons of the snakes, or in another place, the serpents. There is also reference to a subterranean passageway which leads to the roots of heaven. This passage is called the Snake's Hole, and only a serpent may enter it. Here is occult symbolism in no uncertain terms. That the serpent hole which leads to heaven is only for such mortals as have become snakes is equivalent to the statement in the Old Testament that the mysteries of God are only for the initiates. It was customary among ancient peoples to conceal the elements of their philosophical doctrines under mythical adventures ascribed to a hero god who was the personification of the whole mystical system. The legends of Hiawatha are of such origin as well as most of the stories concerning Jesus, Buddha, and other great world teachers. The legends of Quetzalcoatl are no departure from this well-established rule. In his birth, life, and death, we have all the elements of a cosmic myth skillfully treated with definite emphasis upon the theogonic and astronomical elements. Before entering upon the actual life of the god-man, certain explanations are necessary. In the first place, the material from which these accounts are derived is extremely fragmentary, being only the mutilated remnants of a once great literature. Hence, there must be breaks in the thread of the story. In the second place, the tale is made up from the traditions of several nations, each of which has added local color to the narrative. In the third place, nearly all who have attempted to interpret the old legend have done so from an entirely materialistic standpoint, giving no credence whatever to the metaphysical elements involved. Brasseur de Bourbourg and Auguste Le Plongeon were both transcendentally minded, but their efforts find small favor in the eyes of so-called practically minded archaeologists. True, Lord Kingsborough in 1835 attempted to prove that Quetzalcoatl was an Americanized form of Christ, and that the traditions concerning him had been brought by some early missionary, possibly St. Thomas. The present status of the Mexican mythology problem may be summed up in the thought that most men of letters are militantly opinionated, and that where opinions run riot, small heed is taken of facts. To start at the beginning, then, we must ask, who were the Toltecs? To show how obscure the subject really is, we find serious debate as to whether such a race ever actually existed. Those opposing the historicity of the Toltecs declare that the accounts of this people are so mixed up with astronomical cycles that the whole account should be regarded as entirely mythological and related to some previous state of man in the heaven world, or possibly to the progressions of the planets and constellations. Those affirming the reality of the Toltecs declare them to be one of the earliest migrations of the Nahua stock, which moved southward into the Valley of Mexico from the mysterious land of Aztlan, the place of the reeds. Several legends exist concerning the origin of the Nahua peoples whose sacred land was called Tlapalan, which means the country of bright colors. It is also believed that they may have come from Chicomostoc, the sacred seven caverns in the earth. Lewis Spence is of the opinion that these two localities might be New Mexico or Arizona. On the other hand, some of the most authentic traditions point to the fact that Tlapalan could be reached only by water. It has been connected with Atlantic by some writers, while others believe that Asia was the origin, and that these tribes preserved traditions of their migration across Bering Strait by means of canoes. There is an ever-increasing belief in the reality of the Toltec people, but if the philosophical facts were known, the whole account might parallel Plato's description of Atlantis, which is a symbolical and allegorical depiction based upon historical circumstances. In other words, facts and fancy have been woven together to serve the purposes of a priestcraft bent on the preservation of metaphysical truths. According to the historian Ixtlilxochitl, the Toltecs founded the city of Tollan about the year 566 AD. Tollan is now identified with the Mexican city of Tula, about 50 miles from Mexico City. There is a tradition that the Toltecs were led in this migration by a magician who, finally, with the aid of divination, selected the spot upon which the great center of empire was to be established. Now, if the Toltec civilization did not arise until the 6th century AD, it is scarcely probable that it was to these people that Quetzalcoatl came. He would seem to be much earlier. This leads us to believe that the term Toltec is susceptible of two interpretations. While the term has been given to the first migrations of the Nahuas, it may also apply to a mythological period which preceded historical civilization, a period such as we find recorded in Greece, during which the gods walked with men and mysterious things might happen. We follow the historical accounts of the Toltecs, as that nation rose to great heights in the arts and sciences. And then we trace the decline in virtue and integrity which finally precipitated this proud people into oblivion. It is evident that in the last ages of the Toltec Empire, Quetzalcoatl was regarded by them as their patron deity, and his power was invoked to protect them from Tezcatlipoca, the war genius of certain primitive Nahua tribes that finally destroyed the Toltec Empire. But there is a strange silence among the histories as to the actual presence of Quetzalcoatl as a prince or leader at that time, and we are forced to assume that the Toltecs, to whom this prince came in person, were the heavenly progenitors of the nation upon the earth. While dates and places are hopelessly confused, the astonishing profundity of the Quetzalcoatl myth and its correspondence to the mystery rituals of the classical pagan world cannot but awaken admiration and a desire to understand its meaning more clearly. To be continued. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.